Okay, let's just jump right in. Have you ever heard of an empire so massive, so absolutely dominant that it showed up on maps for centuries, and then, poof, it was just gone, wiped clean from history? Well, today, we're digging deep into the mystery of Tartaria, a civilization that some people are convinced has been deliberately scrubbed from our past.
I mean, that's a pretty wild question, right? Just imagine it. We're not talking about some small, forgotten kingdom here. We're talking about a supposed global power, one with incredible technology and these huge, grand cities that was somehow, systematically just removed, wiped from our collective memory. That's the incredible claim we're going to explore.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement, but you know what? It perfectly captures just how sensational the whole Tartarian Empire theory is. So, come on, let's see what kind of evidence its supporters are actually putting forward.
All right, so first up, a lost empire on maps. I mean, what is this modern theory that's just blown up all over the internet? Well, it's really built on four main pillars of what they call evidence, and each one directly challenges what we think we know about, say, the 1800s.
Okay, so let's break these down one by one. First up, you've got the vanished maps. Believers point to all these old maps that show this huge territory called Grand Tartary, and then, over time, it just disappears from later maps. Weird, right? Then there's the impossible architecture. We're talking about these incredibly ornate, massive buildings from the 1800s that theorists say, no way. There's just no way people back then could have built something so complex, so fast. Next, you get the Great Mud Flood. This is a huge one. The theory is that some global catastrophe happened that literally buried entire cities in mud, and that's why you see all these old buildings with doors and windows that seem to be halfway underground. And finally, the World's Fairs. You know those big exhibitions? The theory here is that they weren't for celebrating new inventions. Nope, they were actually used by a new global power to show off the last remaining Tartarian cities right before they demolished them for good.
So, you hear about the mud flood and the World's Fairs all over the internet, right? They're super popular ideas. But where did these radical concepts about a totally lost history really come from? Well, it turns out the seed for all of this, it comes from a source that sounds a lot more academic.
And that brings us to something called the new chronology theory. Honestly, to really get a handle on the whole Tartaria idea, you have to first understand this theory, and the pretty controversial guy who came up with it.
So, meet Anatoly Fomenko. And here's the thing, this isn't some random guy on the internet. He's a respected mathematician, a member of the super prestigious Russian Academy of Sciences. But back in the 1980s, he decided to turn that mathematical brain of his towards history. And the conclusions he came to? Well, let's just say they were absolutely staggering.
So, what exactly is this new chronology? Well, at its core, it's the claim that basically everything we think we know about ancient history is wrong. Flat out wrong. Fomenko argues there was no ancient Rome, no ancient Greece, no ancient Egypt, at least not the way we learn about them. Instead, he says those are all just phantom stories, copies of events that actually happened in the Middle Ages, and that scribes and historians just duplicated them over and over to create this fake super long timeline of history.
I mean, just take a look at how radical this is. According to Fomenko, written history doesn't even start until around 800 AD. All those classical civilizations, Rome, Greece, Egypt, he says they happened 1,000 years later, in the Middle Ages. He even claims that the historical Jesus was actually a 12th century Byzantine emperor. And here's the real kicker. The part that leads us back to Tartaria, he says that for most of history, the world was dominated by one single, massive global empire he calls the Russian Horde.
Okay, so the big question is, how on earth could anyone justify throwing out all of recorded history? Well, Fomenko's answer is simple. He says he doesn't use fuzzy things like traditional historical analysis. He claims to use the hard sciences, math and astronomy, to prove it. So what does that actually look like in practice? Well, their main tool is something called statistical correlation. They analyze old texts to find what they call dynastic parallelisms. For example, they'll argue that the timelines of English kings are statistically identical to the timelines of Roman emperors, so one of them has to be a fake copy of the other. They also go back and recalculate astronomical events like ancient eclipses, and claim the star charts only make sense if those things happened much, much later. Of course, for any of this to work, you have to completely throw out standard dating methods, things like radiocarbon dating or tree ring dating. They just dismiss them as totally flawed.
So, as you can probably guess, mainstream historians and scientists, well,
let's just say they have a very different take on all of this. It's time for the scholarly rejection.
Yeah, in the academic world, Fomenko's new chronology is pretty much universally considered pseudoscience. But here's where it gets interesting. This quote says the theory might have quietly blown away in the wind tunnels of academia if it wasn't for one person, a completely unexpected supporter, the world chess champion Garry Kasparov. Seriously, his public support in the 90s is what really blasted this theory out of obscure academic circles and right into the public spotlight in Russia.
So what you have here is a total clash between two completely different ways of understanding the past. On one side, you have mainstream historical methods. They rely on things you can physically check and cross-reference, like dendrochronology, that's tree ring dating, which gives us this amazing, unbroken record going back over 12,000 years. That record then helps us make stuff like radiocarbon dating super accurate. On the other side, you have Fomenko's methods. He basically says, nope, throw all that physical evidence out. He claims there are gaps, it's unreliable, and instead relies only on his statistical analysis of texts and redating of star charts.
And the mainstream criticisms are severe. I mean, really severe. Academics accuse Fomenko of just cherry-picking the data that fits his theory while ignoring everything that doesn't. They say he forces patterns by literally rearranging rulers and mashing events together to make them correlate. He's also accused of ignoring tons and tons of consistent astronomical records from places like Babylon and China that totally confirm the standard timeline. And maybe the biggest hurdle of all, for this theory to be true, you'd have to believe in a massive, global, centuries-long conspiracy that was so perfect it managed to fake all of world history before the year 1600 without leaving a single shred of evidence behind.
You know, this quote from the Russian archaeologist Valentin really just sums it all up. He compared Fomenko's work to the sleight-of-hand trickery of a David Copperfield. And that really is the academic consensus. It's not seen as a real historical debate, but more like a brilliant magic trick. It looks impressive, but it's ultimately just an illusion.
Okay, so if basically every expert rejects this out of hand, why do people believe it? Why is it so popular, especially in Russia? And how did it eventually morph into these viral online movements like the Tartarian Empire we see today?
Get this. One academic estimates that as many as 30% of Russians might have some sympathy for the new chronology. 30%. That is a staggering number, and it tells you that the appeal of this goes way beyond just arguments about history.
It really seems to be a perfect storm of factors. For one, the theory puts a giant Russian horde at the center of all world history, which definitely appeals to nationalist pride. It also really took off after the fall of the Soviet Union, a time when people had a deep mistrust of any and all official institutions and their stories. And now, its modern spin-off, the whole Tartarian Empire thing, with its mysterious pictures of old buildings and weird maps, it is perfectly suited to go viral on visual platforms like YouTube.
And that really leaves us with the final and maybe most important question. When history itself becomes the subject of a conspiracy theory, how do we actually decide what's real? See, the whole story of Tartaria, it isn't just about some lost empire. It's really about how we know what we know. When you're faced with these really compelling images and this powerful story about secret, suppressed knowledge, it really forces you to ask yourself, okay, how can I tell the difference between actual evidence and just speculation? And maybe more importantly, how do you verify the stories you're told about where we all come from?